Let's get some context on this. Richard Johnson joins us now. He's Senior Lecturer in Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Richard, great to have you with us. Your thoughts on what we've seen today? Anticlimactic in the end, but a swift decision on the next leader of the party and the country.
I think it was fascinating watching Boris Johnson's movements. And if indeed he had 100 MPs, which it seems like he might have done so, he could have become Prime Minister on Friday. But he chose to back out, I think, because he realized he couldn't govern the Conservative Party in Parliament. And that in many ways is going to be the first task of Rishi Sunak, is to get control of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. You know, there'll be about 50 or so die-hard Boris Johnson loyalists in that party who could be the tail that wags the dog. They could, use their leverage to try and get policy concessions. So I think he wants to try to basically build a broad church cabinet and really make some overtures to all different wings of the party to start out to try and stabilise his premiership from the get-go.
And how does he do that? Because we've seen some of the most staunch Boris supporters, Priti Patel, we've already mentioned her on the show, Ian Duncan-Smith coming out and saying, fine, now Rishi Sunak is the candidate. When you're building the next cabinet, Rishi Sunak has to decide between continuity in the names of the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, but also, to your point, building this united government in order to promote to both the party and the country that they can all work together and end the backbiting and the wars within wars.
I mean, it's clear what brought down the previous two prime ministers was that they lost the trust of their own party. In Boris Johnson's case, because of his own management of scandal. In Liz Truss's case, really, because she was too ideological in how she constructed her cabinet and her programme. She didn't do the kind of basic legwork of politics, of building consensus within the party for particular policies, doing some of that work by getting outriders to back up that this is going to be a good policy, this is in the country's interest, this is in the party's interest, and so on. Now, my sense is that Rishi Sunak is a more capable political operator than Liz Truss. So it'll be partly about personnel and who he puts in his cabinet, but it'll also be actually about getting people in who are on his side in the party to actually make the case for the policies that he's pushing, whether that's making the case in conversations with Conservative MPs or going out into the media and making the case that way as well. We haven't seen that kind of hard work done really by either Liz Truss or Boris Johnson. There's been a lot of arrogance, I think, of the most recent Conservative premierships, and Sunak needs to learn the lessons of that.
And who is he? It was fascinating because my colleagues Max and Bianca were talking just before the break about what he actually stands for and this perhaps perception that he's a centrist, but he's got some pretty tough decisions to make beyond the economy, and that, quite frankly, is enough for any one person. But things like immigration, where he tends to take a hard stance. Brexit, another huge complication for the economy. And at the moment, we're in this hard Brexit stance. Does he have the power, the will, the ability to perhaps soften that stance too, which could make a difference for the economy? Richard, how do you see him playing this? Because he's got a lot of work to do in a very short space of time, whether it's on the economy, whether it's on public perception or the run-in for the Conservative Party to the next election.
The question, who is he, is a good one. You know, he's only been in Parliament for 7 years. He becomes Prime Minister with the least parliamentary experience in well over a century. One of the most inexperienced MPs to become Prime Minister in history. That's not to say that he's, doesn't have the talent or ability to be Prime Minister, but it means that he hasn't had a long time to establish his track record. On the Brexit issue, I think it is interesting and of note that within his first year as an MP, an ambitious MP with a bright future ahead of him, he decided to defy the Conservative leadership, David Cameron, and back Leave, which was not the position of the Conservative Prime Minister at the time. He put himself at odds with them. So he surely shows himself to be someone who's willing to take certain risks, perhaps guided by certain key philosophical principles. Maybe some of these, particularly he talked about during Brexit, he was very interested in kind of national sovereignty or matters of immigration, but also agriculture and these sort of things. It's funny how he's kind of more recently been presented as the Remainer choice, and Liz Truss was the Leaver choice, even though Liz Truss voted Remain. That, I guess, gives him a sense of an ability to be flexible, which is no bad thing in this current time. And I think that if he wants to be successful as Prime Minister, he really is going to have to show that he's willing to listen to all wings of his party and try to be a conciliator in the national interest.
Flexibility is okay. Pragmatism, perhaps at this moment, is more important. Richard, very quickly, the party's going to hear. We heard Sir Graham Brady say that Sunak was going to talk to the party in a few moments' time. When he talks to the country, more importantly, very quickly, what do you need to hear from him? What does he have to say?
I think the economy is the big thing, and he has to restore trust in the economy. And because he is the former Chancellor, and has that kind of reputation as being someone who has had experience managing the economy, even if he's only been an MP for 7 years, that'll be quite important for him. People are worried about paying their mortgages. They're worried about the winter fuel crisis coming up. The Conservative Party has taken a huge hit in the polls for a perception of poor economic management, and they have to try to reverse that if they're at all hopeful of holding on to government by the time of the next election.
Yes. Richard Johnson, great to have you with us, Senior Lecturer in Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Our special coverage continues with Max at Westminster.